Passover, which I hope is not a surprise to anyone at this point. And of course, Pesach is the spring holiday, right? Chag HaAviv. In addition to all the other things we're celebrating with liberation and the exodus from Egypt, we definitely have that really strong tradition of, our calendar is based around the fact that this holiday needs to fall in the spring. And I think we've all noticed outside that spring is actually happening. And I think it was probably about 2 weeks ago at this point that I saw the first little shoots of crocuses popping up, which was really heartening as the snow melted away. But I also kind of noticed that I didn't take quite enough time to appreciate them and to really kind of savor those first little bits of green that were coming out, because again, in the run up to Pesach, like, things are hectic, things are busy. It's wonderful to have spring come back to us, but as with all times of transition, it is kind of by definitions chaotic and busy. And even in a year like this one, when we maybe have a little bit more time to ourselves, or really savoring our moments of being outside and in nature, I think it's still, we need to make a really conscientious, or at least I need to make a really conscientious effort to appreciate what's going on around us. And so, as I said, I kind of noticed those first little shoots 2 weeks ago, and it really didn't, I just saw them as I was driving out of my driveway, and I didn't stop to appreciate them. And then a classmate of mine shared this poem by Ada Limon called "Instructions on Not Giving Up" at the beginning of a class, and that was the first time that I really realized that gotta really appreciate the spring that's happening around us. So I want to share that poem with you this morning, and remember that we're, in addition to coming together for Shabbat, coming together for Passover, we're also coming together to share our appreciation for the natural world and the changes that are happening around us. So this is called "Instructions on Not Giving Up" by Ada Limon. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crabapple tree, more than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs shoving their cotton candy colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains, it's the greening of the trees that really gets to me. When all the shock of white and taffy, the world's baubles and trinkets, leave the pavement strewn with the confetti of aftermath, the leaves come. Patient, plodding, a green skin growing over whatever winter did to us, a return to the strange idea of continuous living, despite the mess of us, the hurt, the empty. Fine then, I'll take it, the tree seems to say, a new slick leaf unfurling like a fist to an open palm. I'll take it all. And so we might be a couple weeks ahead of the curve there, in that, we're just seeing the first shoots popping out of the ground, and I haven't seen any new leaves popping out quite yet, but certainly taking a moment to savor all that kind of new energy and greenery and growth that's happening around us, and hopefully finding some source for our own, some source of inspiration for our own energy and renewal in this springtime and time of Pesach, and bringing that into our davening together this morning. And with that, I will put the Siddur up on the screen, and we will start together with Ma Tovu, which can be found on page 61. Ma Tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. Ma Tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. And we continue on page 65 with Birchot HaShachar, the series of blessings, walking us through all the steps of starting our day. And if you would like, please rise. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan savivina lechim ben yom uven laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani b'tzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rokah haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasali kol tzorki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tifara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten li'ayif koach. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, removing sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids. And we will continue on page 72 with the closing paragraph of the Psalm for Shabbat, and back to thinking about trees and the spring process around us. Tzadik Hatamar. Tzadik Hatamar yifrach ke'erez balvanon yiskeh shetulim bebeit Adonai bechatzrot Eloheinu yafrichu od yenuvun b'seivat v'sheinim v'rananim yiyu lehagid ki ashar Adonai tzuri v'lo avlatabo. And we'll continue on page 82 with the first mourner's Kaddish of the day. If anyone would like to unmute and either say the Kaddish along with me or just respond, please do so now. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'alma divrach hirutei ve'amlich malchutei ve'chayechon ve'omechon ve'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael v'agala v'zman kariv v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Shmei Rabba Mevarach Ve'elam Omei Omaya.
Barach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei v'yitadar v'yitalei v'yitpa'al shemei d'kudishta
Riku.
ve'ela min kol derchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata namiran be'alma v'imru Amen.
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 V'hei shalom rabba min Shemaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen.
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 Shalom B'Ramav. Booyah Aseh Shalom Aleinu. V'Yakal Yisrael. V'Yakal Yoshvotevel. Yimru. Amen.
Amen.
And we will go back on mute and turn the page to page 83 and continue with Baruch Shamar. Baruch Shamar v'haya ha'olam Baruch Hu Baruch Oseh v'Reishit Baruch Omer v'Oseh Baruch Gozer u'Mekayim Baruch Merachem al haaretz Baruch Merachem al habriot Baruch B'Shalem Sachar Tov Lireav Baruch Chailad V'Kayam Lanetzach Baruch Podeh U'Matzil Baruch Shemo, Baruch Shemo. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, compassionate creator, extolled by your people, glorified by your faithful servants. We laud you with the psalms of your servant David. We extol you in song. We celebrate your fame in melody. We proclaim you sovereign, singular, eternal God. Praised are you, Adonai, sovereign, magnified with songs of praise. And anyone who is standing may be seated. We'll continue on page 96 with the Ashrei, and we'll do it responsively. I'll say the first line. Anyone who wants to unmute and say the second line, and so on and so forth. Be great to hear some voices. Ashrei Oshrei Veitecha, Od Halucha Selah.
Ashrei ha'am shelo, Ashrei ha'am shadonai Elohav.
Hilal David, Armimcha Hayamelech, Lavarcha Shimcha Leolam Vaed.
V'chol yom ha'checha, v'chol ha'shimcha le'olam va'ed.
Gadol Adonai Me'al Me'od, Ve'ligdalato Ein Cheker.
Dor ledor Yishabach
Ma'asecha, u'kvarasecha yadidu.
Adar Kevod Hodecha, V'reini Flotecha Asicha.
Zeus no roaten yom nehru,
Lasecha asaprena.
Zecharav Tuchayaviu, Ve'tzitcha Chayir Anenu.
Anun Adonai, Erech HaKayim Chesed.
Tov Adonai Lakol, V'rachamav Al Kol Ma'asav.
Yodu kol Adonai kol maasecho,
V'chasidecha yivachucha.
Kevod Malchucha Yomeru, Gvurotcha Yidaberu. Malchutcha Malchut Kol Amim, Umemshotecha B'chol Dor V'Ador.
Somech Adonai l'chol hanoflim,
Einei Kol Echad Yisaberu, V'atanotem Lahem Et Ochlam Be'ito. Tzadik Adonai B'chol Drachav, V'chasid B'chol Ma'asav. Retzon Rav Yaseh, Et Shabbatam Yishma V'Yoshiem.
Shomer Adonai Yashmid.
Vat Adonai Lever Pi, V'Barach Kol Bashar Shkot Shol Elam Va'ed. Thank you all. I will say I'm definitely not ready to have like an entire service like that, but I do love having these couple moments of hearing everyone's voices and being able to kind of pick out one by one. I think it does not necessarily ideal on the Zoom world, but I think it does add a lot. And we will continue on page 100 with Psalm 150, the Hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 El Bekocho, hallelujah, hallelujah, Birki Auzo, hallelujah, 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 Bigurotav, hallelujah, hallelujah, Kerov Gulo, hallelujah, 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 Beteka Shofar, hallelujah, hallelujah. machol. Hallelujah, hallelujah, beninim ve'ugav. Hallelujah, 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 betil tzilei shama. Hallelujah, hallelujah, betil tzilei trua. Kol hanshama tehalel hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehalel hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehalel hallelujah. And we will turn to the top of page 102, and I invite you to rise if you would like, as we sing Az Yashir, the Song of the Sea, again putting us in the mindset for the Exodus from Egypt, which we will be celebrating tonight. Az Yashir Moshe uvenei Yisrael et hashira hazot Adonai vayomru le'emor Ashir al Adonai ki ga sus verochlo rama vayam Ozi vezimratya vayehi Lishua Ze'eli ve'anvehu Elohei Aviv Aromenhu. And we turn the page and continue just above the box. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Ki l'Adonai mulcham shavroim. Balu Moshim Baratunish Bolatari Tsav, Vaital Adonai Hamlucha, Hay Adonai Lamelech Al Kol Haaretz, Vayom Havi Adonai Echad, Ushemo Echad. And if you're standing, you can sit at least for a minute as we turn to the middle of page 105 and continue with Ha'el B'Tatzumot, which will lead us into Yishtabach, the Chatzi Kaddish, and the Baruch. El b'tatzumot uzecha, Hagadol b'chvod shemecha, Hagibor lanetzach, v'nora b'noratecha, Hamelech hayoshev al kisei ram v'nisa, shochen ad marom v'kadosh shemaho, v'chatuv ranu tzadikim b'Adonai, Leishim navatila befi sharim titala uvdivrei tzadikim titbarach uvilshon chasdim titromam uvekerev kedoshim titkadash uvmakalot revivot amcha beit Yisrael b'rinat b'ashim chalmakin b'chol dor v'dor shekein chovat kodesh nilufanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu leodot la'alel shabech l'faer L'romeim lahader l'varech l'aleu kaleis al kol divrei shirot v'tishbachot David ben Yishai Abdecha Meshichecha. Top of page 106. If you would like, please rise. Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu Hayel HaMelech HaGadol VaKadosh B'Shamayim V'Aretz Ki lechane Adonai Eloheinu v'le'avotenu shiru shracha halel v'zimra ozumem shal netzach kula gvura tila tiferet kedusha u'malchut brachot eldot me'ata v'ad olam baruch ata Adonai el noch gadol v'tishbachot el haodot Adonai niflot habocher b'shrei zimra Melech Elchei Ha'olamim. If anyone would like to unmute to respond to the Chatzi Kaddish, please do so. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Amad v'rachritei v'amlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yamachon v'chay l'chol Beit Yisrael v'agalav izman kariv v'imru
Amen.
Ishmei Rabbo
Amen.
Mevorach,
Amen.
Yisabach, Vitbar, Vitol,
Yasbara,
Vitnaseh, Vitadar, Vitale, Vitalal, Shmei, the Kudasha,
Richu,
Ve'ela, Mikol, Berchata, V'shirata, Tushvata,
Tishkata, Venechamata, Damiram Yama, V'emru. Amen.
Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach.
Baruch Adonai
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam.
Amen.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, yoter borei choshech, oseh shalom, borei et hakol. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, creating light and fashioning darkness, ordaining the order of all creation. And anyone who is standing may be seated. We'll continue at the bottom of page 107 with Ein Kirkecha, which will lead us into singing El Adon together. Ein Kirkecha Adonai Eloheinu b'olam hazeh, v'in zlatacha malkeinu l'chayei ha'olam haba. Efes biltecha golenu mot HaMashiach, v'eino melech HaMoshienu l'tchiat hametim. El Adon al kol hamasim, baruch u'mvarach befi kol neshama, gadlo v'tuvo, Male olam da'at utfuna sovevimoto, hamitka el chayot hakodesh, v'nehedar bechavod al hamerkava, zechut u'mishor lifnei chiso, chesed rachamim lifnei kevodo, tovim me'orot shebara Eloheinu yitzaram beda'at bevina ufaskel koach ugvura natan bahem liot moshlim bekerev tevel meleim ziv umfikim nogana ezivam bechol ha'olam Semechim betzeitam nesasim bevoam osim b'eim ha'retzon konam pe'er v'chavod notnim lishmot tzala verina lezecher malchuto kara lashemesh vayizrach ura'a v'hikin surat havana Shevach notnim lo kol tzeva marom tiferet ugedula trafim v'ofanim v'chayot hakodesh. Nai 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 nai. And we will skip ahead to the bottom of page 110 and continue at the box singing Or Chadash. Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir. Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir. V'nizke kulanu mehera leoro. V'nizke kulanu mehera leoro. Baruch atah Adonai yotzer hameorot. And on the top, page 111, let's read together in the English. Deep is your love for us. Deep is your love for us, Adonai, our God, boundless your tender compassion. Avinu Malkeinu, you taught our ancestors life-giving laws. They trusted in you. For their sake, graciously teach us. Our Maker, merciful provider, show us mercy, grant us discernment and understanding. Then will we study your Torah, heed its words, teach its precepts, and follow its instruction, lovingly fulfilling all its teachings. Open our eyes to your Torah, help our hearts cleave to your mitzvot, unite all our thoughts to love and revere you. Then we will never be brought to shame, for we trust in your awesome holiness and will delight in your deliverance. Bring us safely from the four corners of the earth and lead us in dignity to our holy land. For you are the source of deliverance. You have called us from all peoples and tongues, constantly drawing us nearer to you, that we may lovingly offer you praise, proclaiming your oneness. Praised are you, Adonai, who loves the people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai, habocher b'amo Yisrael, b'ahava. And on the top of page 112, we unmute and come together for the Shema and the B'ahavta.
Shema
Yisrael,
Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Kol nafshecha, kol meyodecha, v'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh, asher anoki mitzavcha hayom al levavecha, levanecha v'dibarta bam, v'shivtecha b'veitecha, v'techa v'derek, Apacha Chumecha, Usham Liot Adanecha, V'hayulatotafot Einenecha, Uftatam Al Mizot Beitecha, Uvisharecha.
אם שמוע תשמעו מצוותיי אשר אנוכי מצווה אתכם היום לאהבה את אדוני אלוהיכם ולעבדו בכל לבבכם ובכל נפשכם ונתתי את ארצכם ויתרם מלכוש ואספת דגנך ותירשך ויתרך ונתתי עשה בשדך לבהמתך ואכלת ושבעת הישמרו לכם פן לבבכם וסרתם ועברתם אלוהים אחרים השתחוויתם להם וחרף אדוני בכם ועצר את השמיים ולא יהיה מטר והאדמה לא תיתן תבולה ועברתם מהרה מעל הארץ הטובה אשר אדוני נותן לכם ושמתם את דבריי אלה על לבבכם ועל נפשכם וקשרתם אותם לאות על ידכם, והיו תותפות בין עיניכם, לימדתם אותם את פניכם לדבר בם, בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך וישעריך, למען ירבו ימיכם וימי בניכם על האדמה אשר נשבע אדוני לאבותיכם לתת להם, כי מהשמיים על הארץ, ויאמר אדוני משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם, ועשו להם ציצית, על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם, ונענו על ציצית, הכנף בטיל תכלת, והיה לכם לציצית. וראיתם אותו, וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם, אשר אתם זונים אחריהם, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. Adonai Elohechem Emet. And in just a moment, we will continue in the middle of page 114 with Michamocha, which again puts us right back in that moment of the Exodus from Egypt and the splitting of the sea. After that, we will begin the Amidah together. We'll say the first couple blessings together, come unmuted for the Kedusha, and then take a couple minutes for silent prayer and reflection and meditation after that, and then come back together all together with the Oseh Shalom. And then just one note on this morning's Amidah. We still say today, Mashiv Haruach Morid Hagashem. Thank God for bringing the wind and the rain. And again, we're in the middle of another one of those super windy and blustery streaks here. But that prayer will change tomorrow, and in another sign of the shifting seasons. So just keep that in mind as you go through the Amidah this morning, that we're kind of really noting these shifts and incorporating them into our services. First, the middle of page 114. Tilo le'yon baruch barach Moshe Miriam uvnei Israel lechanu shira v'simcha rabah ve'amru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha Nedar ba'kodesh nora tehilot osei feleh Shira chadasha shilchu gelin l'shimcha svat hayam yachad kulam hoduvim lichu ve'ameru Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed Tzur Yisrael kuma ve'ezrat Yisrael Ufdechinu mecha Yehuda ve'Yisrael Go aleinu Adonai tzvot shemo Kedosh Yisrael Baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael. On page 115b. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu v'Imoteinu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah El Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Hakol Vezocher chasdei avot v'imahot u'mevi gol ivnei bneihem leman shemo b'ahava melech ozer ufoked u'moshia u'magen baruch atah Adonai magen Avraham ufoked Sarah atah gibor le'olam Adonai mechayei metim atarav le'oshia mashiv haruach u'morid hagashem Mechalkel chaim bechesed, mechayei metim berachamim rabim. Somech noflim verofei cholim, umatir asurim, umekayem emunato lishenei afar, michamocha ba'al gevurot. Umido melach, melech memit, umechaye, umatmiach Yeshua, v'ne'emanat halachayot metim. Baruch atah Adonai, mechaye hametim.
Dekadesh Hashem ha be'olam, kishem shemakdishim oto bishmei moram. Hakotu vayad v'yakov v'korazeh el zeh v'yamar.
Kadesh et shimcha ba'olam kishem shemakdishim oto bishmei marom kakatu vayad v'yakov v'korazeh el zeh v'yamar.
Kadosh, 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 Hai Tavot, Koretz Kavodo, Oz B'Kol Rash Gadol, Idea V'Kozok Mashmim Kol, B'Nasim U'Masarafim, Matam Baruch Yomeiru.
Az B'Kol Rash Ashgadol Adir Chazak Mashmim Kol Az Vekol Rash Gadol Adir Chazak Mashmim Kol Mit Nasim Leumat Serafim Mit Nasim Leumat Serafim Leumatam Baruch Yomeinu
Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimakom Makom Malkeinu Tofia Vikim Lokoleinu Kim Mekakim Anaknu Lok Martai Kim Lok Bitzion Vikarobi Almenu Lilam Boet Tishkon Tikadal Betikadash Betok Yerushalayim Ircha Gadol Vador Netzach Netzachim
במקום חמקים התופיע ותמלוך ונקים מחכים אנחנו לך מתי תמלוך בציון בקרוב בימינו לעולם ותשכון תתגדל ותתקדש בתוך ירושלים עירך לדור ודור לנצח נצחים
V'yeneinu tirenu malchutecha adavar
על ידי דוד משיח צדקך ימלוך
Yimlok Adonai Le'olam Elohim Tzion L'dor vador Hallelujah.
לדור ודור נגיד גודלך ונצח צחים קדושתך נקדיש בשבחך אלוהינו יגנו מושלם בית כי המלך גדול וקדוש אתה ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, Shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom. Shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom. Shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom. Shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'meru. Amen. And we will continue with the full Kaddish. Anyone who wants to respond, please unmute and do so. Yitkadal v'yikadash shmei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'alma divrach yirtei ve'amlich malchutei b'chai chor v'chor v'chai l'chol Beit Yisrael b'agala v'zman karib v'meru.
Amen.
Yesh mei Rabba
Mevorach,
mevorach,
Olam
Olam
Le'almaya.
Yivarach.
V'par v'shaman v'naseh v'tadar v'talei v'talal shmei t'kudesha.
Brichu.
Ve'elam v'kol berchata v'shirata t'shchata v'nechamata d'amiran ve'alma v'meru.
Amen.
Kabal Torodahon, the Chol Beit Yisrael, Kadam V'Vohon Nevishmaya, V'meru.
Amen.
Yehei Shalom Rav Min Shemaya, V'chaim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, V'meru.
Amen.
Yaseh shalom b'mrama, Yaseh shalom
Aleinu v'al
aleinu.
kol Yisrael.
Amen.
And we will go back on mute, and I'll ask Barry Pastor to unmute himself one more time. And we will continue with the beginning of the Torah service and the opening of the Ark.
Ein kamocha be'elim Adonai v'ein kemasecha. Malchusecha malchus kol olamim. Umemshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor. Adonai melech, Adonai malach. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai oz li'amo yitain. Adonai yivorech es amo b'shalom. Aporachamim eiti b'bertzoncha es Zion. Became Katzimo Yushalayim. Ki b'chol levad b'tachnu melech el ram v'nisa Adon olamim. Vayehi ben Aharon vayomer Moshe Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu mesanecha mipanecha ki mitzion tetzei sorah. Ki mitzion tetzei sorah u'devar Adonai miYerushalayim. Baruch shenasan Torah Torah. Baruch shenasan Torah Torah. Ni'amo Yisrael b'hikdusha so.
Thank you, Barry. Yasher Koach. Anyone who is standing may be seated, and we will continue on with the Torah service. Shabbat Shalom once again, everyone, and good morning. It's really, really nice to see so many people. And yeah, to be together. It's nice this year, and we'll talk about this a little bit after the Torah reading. When Pesach begins on a Saturday night, everything feels a little bit weird. It's just not quite the run up to the first Seder that we're used to. And getting ready for the Seders, getting ready for Passover really is, no matter what we do, I feel like it just has to be a hectic process. I feel like it is like ingrained in the experience and certainly part of the heritage of Passover, for better or worse. But when the first Seder falls on a Saturday night and leads immediately out of Shabbat, we are kind of forced to prepare differently and, take some more moments of rest in ways that we would probably otherwise not do on the day before Pesach. And so I hope this morning, as you're all here and joining together, that this does feel like a little bit of a rest and an opportunity to unplug from whatever kind of stress of hosting or getting ready for a Zoom Seder or whatever it might be, or any other kind of external stress in your life, and connect and have a couple moments to kind of breathe and relax. So I'm glad we're all here, is the long story short. This morning is called Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Shabbat, which also we'll talk about a little bit later, and that is the Shabbat before Pesach every year. And just as often as not, it falls on the weekend of Parshat Tsav, which we're going to be reading this morning. And for some of you who are either new or haven't joined us in a while, we'll see whether you regret picking this morning to join us, because Parshat Tsav is not one that is necessarily going to hook your brain into everything that the Torah has to offer. Without selling it too short, this is another go-around of the sacrifices. And so last week they were kind of new and exciting in chapters 1 through 5 of Leviticus. This week it's really just a rehash in chapters 6 and 7 of Leviticus. So if you're already not finding too much meaning in the sacrifices last week, this week might be a little bit difficult for you. The reason that we have this kind of almost verbatim, it's not a verbatim repetition, but it is kind of a thematic repetition. And the understanding is that last week when we laid out all the sacrifices, that was kind of a level of detail and instruction for the people who would be bringing them, so for the Israelite nation. This week, when we're rehashing all the sacrifices, it's more for the sake of the priests and the Kohanim. So it's more of an instruction manual of, this is what you guys do when the people bring you animals to sacrifice. And there definitely are those two different roles of the people who are bringing the sacrifices and the priests and the Kohanim who are offering them. And then towards the end of this morning's reading, we won't actually read this, but towards the end of this morning's Parsha, we actually have the consecration of the tabernacle and offerings being offered. So we do at least have some kind of closure on all this, right? At least back in that time, it was not just theoretical instructions. These were things that were very real to them. And so after they go into this long list of sacrifices and instructions, they actually start to carry them out. In some ways, even though I did bash it a little bit, it's certainly appropriate to be reading about sacrifices the morning before the Seder and immediately before Passover starts. I think that for all of our Jewish rituals and holiday celebrations, I think Passover really does have the strongest connection still to its sacrificial roots. Obviously we don't have the actual Paschal sacrifice anymore. We don't offer the Korban Pesach, but we do have the tradition of keeping a shank bone, or in modern days, a chicken wing or a chicken neck or even a beet front and center on our Seder plate to kind of remind us of that heritage of the sacrifice and the really, really central role it played in Passover specifically. All of the Jewish holidays, the biblical Jewish holidays, not the modern Jewish holidays, have sacrifices attached to them, and that we do or that were done to celebrate the holiday. But it's really on Pesach where we make a very explicit connection between that history of sacrifice and our own observance and rituals. And I want to give us one more way to kind of connect or to possibly think about connecting to the sacrifices that we'll read about this morning. And to do that, I want to read a short passage from the Babylonian Talmud, which kind of gives an account of the rabbis' own struggle to connect in this way. The rabbis of the Talmud was written, or it was discussed and then written somewhere between the 3rd and 6th centuries. And so these rabbis were kind of the first few generations that had to actually figure out, what does Judaism look like without being able to carry out these sacrifices? What could Passover look like without being able to do the Paschal sacrifice? And what do we do with all of this text that we read every year that is becoming, as the actual rituals are no longer available, the text becomes more and more central to the Jewish experience and to the Jewish liturgy. And so they were really trying to figure out what to do with all of these passages, much like the ones we're going to read this morning. And so I want to read a short excerpt from the Talmud where they are essentially discussing this. And what the Talmud does here is it imagines a conversation between Abraham and God. Back when Abraham was kind of building his own relationship with God and figuring out kind of how God relates to humanity and how God will ultimately relate to Abraham and Sarah's descendants, who will become the Israelites and the Jews. So Abraham said, "Master of the universe, perhaps the Jews will sin before you. Will you treat them as you did the generation of the flood and the generation of the dispersion and destroy them?" God said to Abraham, "No." Abraham said before God, "Master of the universe, how can my descendants ensure that you will maintain the world?" So you can see Abraham is already tuning into the fact that God is maybe, a little bit reactive. And even Abraham is not quite taking God at God's word, that even though God says there won't be destruction, Abraham needs a little bit of proof. God replied to Abraham, "Take for me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." God was alluding to the offerings in whose merit the Jewish people, and through them the entire world, will be spared divine punishment. Abraham said before God, "Master of the universe, this works out well when the temple is standing. But when the temple is not standing, what will become of them?" Essentially, Abraham is already, this is obviously like a deep interpretive midrash, but Abraham is not only foreseeing the time when the temple will be standing, but also foreseeing the time when the temple will be destroyed and sacrifices will no longer be an option. God replied to Abraham, "I have already enacted for them the order of the offerings. When they read the offerings before me, let me reemphasize there. When they read the offerings before me, I will ascribe them credit as though they had sacrificed them before me, and I will pardon them for all their transgressions. Since the offerings ensure the continued existence of the Jewish people and the rest of the world, the act of creation is read in their honor." And so going all the way back to the Talmud, if not necessarily explicitly to Abraham, these rabbis were clearly they had their own struggle with trying to make this relevant and pertinent and alive, and figuring out, well, what is the value going forward? And so the answer they put forward is that kind of reading it as the same as the action. And even though we can't actually offer the sacrifices, acknowledging it as part of our history and as something that meant so much in the building and maintaining of the relationship between the people of God, that's going to kind of have to be enough. The two other aspects that I really want to bring into this conversation is, first of all, just as we are on the eve of another, mostly Zoom Passover, just how much the Jewish people have always dealt with flux and have always been willing to kind of accommodate for the conditions that surround us and innovate when necessary. We certainly kind of can get in the habits of thinking of our traditions as a little bit staid and unchangeable. But I think even going back to a passage like this, we recognize how important it is to be able to accommodate for extenuating circumstances and to find ways to make meaning when the ways that we've relied on to make meaning have been kind of taken away from us. And also just the idea of, thinking about what is the connection between our own rituals and practices and the rituals and practices that they might be symbols for. And so, when we look at the shank bone on our Seder plates tonight and tomorrow night, do we think of that as a modern day symbol for something, or does that tie us into the Paschal offering that was offered 2,000 years ago? And kind of how are we doing that work of making it alive, or are we just throwing it on there because that's what we've always done and it feels like checking a box that we want to check? And so as we read through some of the language of the offerings this morning, thinking a little bit more about whether how we can strive to connect to that as part of the long biblical heritage. Any question? Yeah, Mom.
Yeah, so when you were reading from the Talmud before, and there was mention early on about they will be singing to me. God says to Abraham, they will be singing to me. So I was just thinking about in the tabernacle, there was always this mention of the Levites and the priests singing to while they were involved in all this sacrificial ritual. And that for me, that's like the origin of prayer, or thinking of the Psalms. And so many of our prayers are actually from singing and are related to Psalms. So that's a real link that I was thinking of when you were talking before.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice link as well. One of the liturgical kind of mainstays of all our holiday celebrations is the Hallel, which we say both at the Seders traditionally and through all of our holiday services. And that is a series of psalms, pretty much like a verbatim, I forget what numbers, but it's 7 or 8 psalms in a row, and it is a really heavily. It's traditionally sung from beginning to end, and that service goes back to temple times and was done with a lot more celebration and singing and dancing and instruments than we would necessarily work into a standard synagogue service. And interestingly enough, to offer another kind of Talmudic tidbit and one that relates to the sacrifices, they said that when the Israelites came to the temple to offer the Paschal sacrifice, there were so many people coming that they had to do it in 3 shifts, that they couldn't possibly do it all at once. And so they would kind of break the entire group up into 3 groups, or the entire nation up into 3 groups. And their waiting room music was essentially the Hallel. And so they would start the Hallel and they would accompany it with singing and dancing and instruments. And as soon as they got to the end, they would just start again. And so there is this really explicit connection between what is the antiquity of sacrifice as worship and the transition to singing and praying and davening and speech, as if not quite as worship. Well, it depends whatever word you want to use for worship or prayer. But that's certainly, that is a pretty explicit transition in modernity, but the two have always been together. And so, yeah, finding those connections is a really powerful thing. Any other questions, comments, thoughts before we move into the Torah reading? Great. So in just a minute going, Jerry, do you want to say a Gomel? I know you had mentioned that. Do you want me to pause for that at some point?
Yeah, we can do that after you read a portion of the Torah.
Yep. Yeah.
But
So
we can all do the prayer beforehand.
yeah. Yeah, we're not going to do it right now. I just wanted to know to pause for you. So it's not a very long Torah reading this morning. It's only 27 verses, so we will move through it reasonably quickly. After we say the bracha to start it together, Lasok b'divrei Torah, I'll start, and then I'll pause and explain why I'm pausing, and then we'll let Jerry say the Gomel, which is the traditional bracha on kind of overcoming a dangerous situation or being healed. And of course, he's back with us after a long battle with coronavirus and beating the cough and everything that comes with it. So we're certainly going to be glad to hear that from you, Jerry. So first, let's say the bracha together, Lasok b'divrei Torah, and then we will go into the Torah reading, which this morning is Leviticus chapter 7, verse 11, which in the Eitz Chaim is on page 617. And if you want to unmute and join me in the bracha, please do so now. Baruch atah Adonai
Eloheinu
melech haolam, asher
kishanu
Divrei Torah.
Torah.
Amen. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, for allowing us to delve into matters of Torah together. Let me just pull it up on the screen. Amen. Vezot Torah Zevach Hashlamim Asher Yakriv Ladonai Im Al Todah Yakrivenu V'Hikriv Al Zevach HaTodah Chalot Matzot Belulot Bashemen Urkikei Matzot Meshuchim Bashamen Vesolet Murbechet Chalot belulot bashamen al chalot lechem chametz yakriv korbano al zavach todat shlamav v'hikriv mimenu echad mikol korban truma ladonai lakohen hazorek etam hashlamim lo yeh uvesar Zevach todat shlamav beyom korbano yeachel lo yaniach mimenu ad boker bim neder onedava zevach korbano beyom akrivo et sivcho yeachel umimachorat vanotar mimenu yeachel V'hanotar mibsar hazavach bayom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im heyachol yeachel mibsar zevach shlamav bayom hashlishi lo yeratzeh hamakriv oto lo yechashev lo piguliyeh V'hanefesh haochelet mimenu avonatisa. Oops. And I'm sorry, I forgot to put it up on the screen. That's on me. I clicked it up for myself and not for any of you. I will do it for the second half. My apologies, but this is a good place to pause. And in just 1 second, I'll turn it over to Jerry, but I do want to read one comment from the Eitz Chaim that, again, is very pertinent to both Jerry's about to be reading the Gomel and to this idea of kind of making connections between the sacrifices and modern practice. So we just read this section about the Thanksgiving offering, which of all the offerings is the only one that is kind of purely optional and discretionary. It's the only one where you can say, hey, something good is going on in my life. I want to bring an offering to God to recognize that. And what the commentary in our Chumash says is that an individual brings an offering of thanksgiving in response to having been spared for disaster, which produces probably one of the most profound emotions that people will ever know. The Talmud identifies the circumstances in which a person should bring a todah. When one has safely completed a dangerous journey, recovered from illness, been released from confinement, or survived other dangers. The custom continues to this day in the Gomel blessing offered in the synagogue during the Torah reading by a worshiper who has avoided or survived misfortune. The Talmudic text states that people need to bring a todah rather than are obliged to bring one, perhaps to suggest that the grateful individual brings the todah to fulfill a psychological need rather than to meet a religious obligation. And so, we see the roots of kind of recognition all the way back to the sacrificial times, and we do enact them with pretty some regularity in our own services as well. And on that note, Jerry, do you have the text in front of you, or you need me to put it up on the screen? Oh, you got to unmute yourself, Jerry.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hagomel l'chayavim tovos, shegbamani kol tov.
Amen.
Amen.
Kol tov, huyig malcha, kol tov, selah.
Kol tov, selah.
Praised are you, Adonai, our God, who rules the universe, showing goodness to us beyond our merits, for bestowing favor upon us. May God, who has been gracious to you, continue to favor you with all that is good. Jerry, it's good to have you back. We're glad you're feeling better. And yeah, I'm glad you were able to share that with us this morning. So we are going to turn back to the Torah reading, and this time I really will put it up on the screen, I promise. And we are picking up in chapter 7, verse 19. And I am likely just going to read it through to the end of this morning's Torah reading. Amen. Vehabasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yeachel ba'esh yisaref. Vehabasar kol tahor yochal basar. Vehanefesh asher tochal basar. Mizevach hashlamim asher ladonai. Betumato alav v'nichreta hanefesh ahi me'ameha v'nefesh ki tiga b'chol tamei betumat adam o b'veimat me'ah o b'chol sheket tamei ve'achal mibsar zevach hashlamim asher ladonai v'nichreta hanefesh ahi me'ameha Vayidaber Adonai Moshe lemor, daber Adonai Yisrael lemor, kol chelev, shor v'chesed, va'iz lo tochelu, v'chelev nevela, v'chelev treifa, ye'aseh l'chol melacha, ve'achol lo tochluhu, ki kol ochel chelev min ha'beima, asher yakriv mimena, Yishel Adonai v'nichreta hanefesh achelet me'ameha v'chol dam lo tochlu v'chol moshrotechem la'of v'la'behema kol nefesh asher tochal kol dam v'nichreta hanefesh ahi me'ameha וידבר אדוני משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל לאמור, המקריב את זבח שלמיו לאדוני, יביא את קורבנו לאדוני מזבח שלמיו, ידיו תביאנה את אישי אדוני, את החלב על החזה יביאנו את החזה, להניף אותו תנופה לפני אדוני, והקטיר הכהן את החלב המזבחה, והיה החזה לארון ולבניו, ואת שוק הימין תיתנו תרומה לכהן, מזבחי שלמיכם המקריב את דם השלמים, ואת החלב מבני אהרון לא תהיה שוק הימין למנה, כי את חזה התנופה ואת שוק התרומה לקחתי מאת בני ישראל מזבחי שלמיהם ואתן אותם לארון הכהן ולבניו לחוק עולם מאת בני ישראל. זאת משחת אהרון ומשחת בניו מאישי אדוני, ביום הקריב אותם לכהן לאדוני, אשר ציווה אדוני לתת להם, ביום משכו אותם מאת בני ישראל, חוקת עולם לדורותם. זאת התורה לעולה למנחה ולחטאת ולאשם ולמילואים ולזבח השלמים, אשר ציווה אדוני את משה בהר סיני ביום צוותו את בני ישראל, להקריב את קורבניהם לאדוני במדבר סיני. And we are going to pause there with this morning's Torah reading. And yeah, I'm going in just a moment to turn it over to Sharon to lead us through the healing service. Obviously a really important aspect of our time together. And I just want to also bring in last week, with the bar mitzvah, we still did the healing service, but also I didn't take the time to acknowledge a lot of the pain that's being felt across our country with the recent bouts of gun violence in both Colorado and the Atlanta area, and just remembering that when we pray for healing, it's hard to look past all even just like the physical healing that has been such a present need always, but especially over the last year, but also thinking beyond into spiritual healing and psychological healing, and certainly healing from all kinds of trauma that we're experiencing and that is being experienced with too much regularity across our nation. So Sharon, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, let's begin the healing service, please, with the song that we generally use for that purpose. If you know it, please join me as best you can from wherever you are. Mi sheberach avotenu mekor habracha limotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu mekor habracha la'avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Misha berach avotenu v'imotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Moshe v'Aharon, David u'Shlomo, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, v'Leah, Bilha v'Zilpa, v'Yivarech v'Yirafeh et hacholim b'nei Avraham v'Sarah, b'nei Adam v'Chava. May God, who blessed our ancestors, bless and heal all those in need of it now. And these are the names that we know of, and we'll ask everybody to include whatever other names you have after I read this one. Bring healing to Shoshana bat Pinchas v'Chana, Tom Zabo, Simone bat Camille, Meir ben Fegev Aaron Yitzchak, Dennis McNeely, Jess Kramer, Alexis Watson, May Daub, Bob Jelly, Bruce Mallory, Alan Mann, Barbara Dowd. I am happily not including Jerry's name right now, which is what would happen next. John O'Brien, Jacques Mansey, Carol Barker, Catherine Doloff, Ken Bosi, Chana Bat Rivka, Lorraine Daniluk, Denise Stelmack, Dennis Montini, Yitzchak Ben Yisrael, Madeline Blake, Rachel Barcelona, Corey Brown, Kara Smoley, Adam Stander, Fotios Rallis, Chana Esther Bat Ayala Hadar, Batya Bat Neshama V'Meir, Zohar Fered. And now, if you have a name that hasn't been mentioned, which you would like to include in the healing service, if you would just indicate that now, Alex can unmute you one by one.
Yeah, Barry and Barbara Ann.
Dov Ber ben Yona v'Chava, Edel Nesha bat Zev v'Etanesha, Chaya Yehudit bat Ruvain Eliyahu Halevi v'Edel Nesha, Avraham ben Zev v'Etanesha, Chaya Sora, Anita Wilson, Daniel Rutas, Nate Hotkin, Kathy Whittemore, Greg Bow, Judith Kindling, Caravan, the three Liangs, Pat Matson, and Jen Della Rosa.
Bela Adela Bas Baraleb for Fred Gamero.
Jerry?
Sharon Morell.
Angie?
Meshulam ben Hava, Bonnie Salzberg, Phyllis Heyman.
Thank you. Janet, if you want to unmute yourself. Looks like Janet might have frozen. Let's give her a minute and we can come back to her. Were there any other hands that I didn't see yet? Janet, do you want to unmute yourself and try one more time? You froze last time.
Diane Sheldon.
Great, thank you. And of course, even with all those names we've included, there's so many more people, both people we know and people we don't know, who need our prayers of healing and who need some extra strength and support. So let's take just another 30 seconds or a minute to include as many people as we possibly can in our hearts and minds and really spread those prayers of healing far and wide. Sharon, whenever you're ready.
Ba'avur she'anachnu mitpalalim ba'avuram, bishkar zeh hakadosh baruch hu yimalei rachamim aleihem, lahachalimam ulrapotam, ולהחזיקם ולהחיותם, וישלח להם מהרה רפואה שלמה, רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף, שבת היא לזעוק, ורפואה קרובה לבוא, השתה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ונאמר
Amen. Thank you, Sharon. In just one more minute, I'll turn it over to my mom and we'll continue with the Haftarah. I want to include this week, just briefly, the prayer for the state of Israel. I know we don't say this every week. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. In coronavirus times, we haven't been saying it every week. But in the week when Israel is coming off its fourth round of elections that have still proved completely fruitless, it seems, and when we're seeing kind of some of the more pernicious elements of American politics creeping into Israeli politics, certainly keeping the situation in Israel on our mind and praying that, I mean, praying sometimes it feels like is all we can do, that somehow they'll find some ways to move forward and to break stalemates. And I do think that there's at least one event being held by CJP or Lapin Foundation over the next couple of weeks online, kind of delving into a little bit more of the political situation in Israel and exactly what is going on and how they've gotten to this point and possibly how they can get out of it. So that will be an e-blast. So keep your eyes out for that. But I do want to include the prayer for the state of Israel this week, and I'm going to say it in Hebrew. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzmicha Kulatenu. Hagen alea be'evrat chastecha, ufros aleha sukat shlomecha, ushlach orcha v'amitcha l'rasheha, sareha v'yoatzea, v'taknei beitzah tual mufanecha. Chazek et idei neginei eretz kodshenu, v'anchilim alhin Yeshua, v'ater tzachon tatrim, v'natata shalom ba'aretz, v'simchat olam le'yoshveha, v'nomar Amen. Rock and Redeemer of the people Israel, bless the state of Israel with its promise of redemption. Shield it with your love, spread over it the shelter of your peace. Guide its leaders and advisors with your light and your truth. Help them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those who defend our holy land. Deliver them, crown their efforts with triumph. Bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. And let us say, Amen. I am now going to turn it over to Judy Matthews, who's going to read this morning's Haftarah, which is in honor of Shabbat Hagadol, this great Shabbat. It is a reading from Malachi chapter 3. And yeah, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will put the text up on the screen. It's on page 1296 if you have an Eitz Chaim at home.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nim tovim v'ratza b'divreihem u'nimarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'torav Moshe avdo u'b'Yisrael amo u'b'ndiei ha'emet Tzedek ve'arba l'Adonai Minchat Yehuda v'Yerushalayim Kimei olam u'chashanim kadmoniyot v'karavti alechem lamishpat v'hayiti eid memaher Bam chashvim uvamenafim uvanishpaim lashaker uvaaskei schar sachir almana biatom umatener v'lo yireuni amar Adonai Tzvaot. Ani Adonai lo shaniti v'atem b'nei Yaakov lo chlitem lemimei avotechem sartem b'chukai v'lo shemartem shuvu elai v'ashuva alechem amar Adonai Tzvaot v'amartem b'amenu shuv Hayikvadam Elohim, ki atem kovim oti, va'amartem v'mekiv va'anucha, hamaser v'hatruma, v'am'era atem ne'arim, oti atem kovim, hagoy kulo. Haviu et kol hamaser el beit haotzar, v'yiteref beveti ubechanuni na bazot, amar Adonai Tzivot, im lo eftach lachem et arubot hashamayim, v'harikoti lachem beracha ad belidai, v'ga'arti lachem ba'ochel, v'lo yashchit lachem et bri ha'adama, v'lo tishakel lachem hagefen basadeh, amar Adonai Tzvaot, v'yishru etchem kol hagoyim, ki tiyu atem eretz chayfetz, amar Adonai Tzvaot, chazku alai, divrechem amar Adonai, v'amartem, manidbarnu alecha, amartem, shav avod Elohim, umabetza, ki shamarnu mishmarto, v'chi halachnu kidorani mipnei Adonai Tzvaot, ve'ata anachnu me'ashrim zeitim, gam nivnu osei rish'ah, gam bachanu Elohim vayimaletu, az nitberu, yireh Adonai ish al re'ehu, vayakshev Adonai vayishma, vayikatev sefer zicharon lefanav, liyireh Adonai ulechoshvei shimo, v'hayuli amar Adonai Tzvaot layom, asher ani oseh segula v'chamalti aleihem, kasher yachmo ish al beno ha'oved oto, v'shavtem uritem ben tzadik lirasha, ben oved Elohim la'asher lo avadu, ki hine hayom ba boer katanur, v'hayu kol zeitim v'chol osei risha kash, v'lihatotam hayom haba, amar Adonai Tzvaot, asher lo yazov lahem shoresh ve'anav, v'zarcha lachem, yirei shemi shemesh tzedakah, umarpei bichnafeha, vitzitem uvishtem ke'eglei marpei, vasotam rishayim, ki yu efer tachat kapot raglechem, vayom asher ani oseh, amar Adonai Tzvaot, zichru Torat Moshe avdi, asher tziviti oto v'chorev al kol Yisrael, chutzim u'mishpatim, hine anochi sholeach lachem, et Eliyahu hanavi, lifnei bo yom Adonai Hagadol v'hanora, Ve'ishiv levavot al banim, v'lev banim al avotam, v'navo v'iketi et haaretz cherem, hine anochi sholeach lachem, et Eliyahu hanavi, lifnei bo yom Adonai Hagadol v'hanora, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol olamim, tzadik b'chol hadorot, האל הנאמן, האומר ועושה, המדבר ומקיים, בכל דבריו אמת וצדק. נאמן, אתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו ונאמנים דבריך, ודבר אחד מדבריך, אחור לא ישוב ריקם. יהיה מלך נאמן ורחמן אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני.
Shmo.
האל הנאמן בכל דבריו,
Amen.
רחם על ציון כי בית חיינו, ולעלובת נפש תושיע במהרה בימינו, ברוך אתה אדוני.
Shmo.
משמח ציון בבניה,
Amen.
שמחנו אדוני אלוהינו בעליון אביבתך, ומלכות בית דוד משיחך, במהרה יבוא ויגל ליבנו, על כיסאו לא ישב זר ולא ינחלו אחרים את כבודו. כי בשם קודשך נשבעת לו, שלא יכבה נברא לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני,
Shmo.
מגן דוד.
Amen.
על התורה ועל עבודה ועל נביאים ועל יום השבת הזה, שנתת לנו, אדוני אלוהינו, לקדושה ולמנוחה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל, אדוני אלוהינו, אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך. יתברך שמך בפי כל חי, תמיד לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש השבת.
Amen. Yasher Koach, Mom. Thank you so much. And of course, my mom's been doing most of the Haftarot for us recently, but certainly on Shabbat Hagadol, where it does provide that really explicit connection, I'm glad to have her be doing it. And so I do want to talk about this idea of Shabbat Hagadol for just a couple minutes. The Great Shabbat. It's kind of written in large letters on Jewish calendars, but it's not entirely clear what it means or what makes it so great. And there are three kind of conventional derivations for what we're talking about when we're talking about Shabbat Hagadol. The first is a little bit kind of the snake eating its tail, which is it does relate back to the Haftarah, but the Haftarah is obviously picked to come on this Shabbat, so you can't necessarily ascribe one to the other. But this name of Shabbat Hagadol comes from the second to last verse, which gets repeated as the last verse. Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo yom Adonai Hagadol v'hanora. Lo, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of the Lord. And that, of course, has to do with this idea of Pesach as a holiday of redemption. And so the classic understanding is that when the Messiah does come with Elijah the prophet as his forebearer, it will happen over Passover. And so we kind of make this association very explicit in our Haftarah reading this morning from the book of Malachi. The second explanation goes back to the original Exodus from Egypt, and again tied back to the Paschal sacrifice. And there is a midrashic interpretation that says that when the Israelites were preparing to leave Egypt, when they were preparing the actual sacrifice, they chose the lambs for slaughter on the Shabbat before the actual events of the Exodus occurred. And then being able and allowed to go through this process of choosing and designating lambs for slaughter and sacrifice was in itself a very great miracle, because under normal circumstances in Egyptian society, this never would have been allowed. Both in terms of kind of the agency that the Jews had, that the Israelites had to undergo this process and select these animals, and also the fact that, again, the lambs as a symbol of divinity within Egyptian culture, had the Egyptians recognized that the Israelites were choosing lambs to slaughter, that certainly would have been prohibited, and they never would have given the Israelites the freedom to do that. So just a very selection process in itself was a miracle that we celebrate on the Shabbat before Passover. And the third, and this is kind of probably the most well-known explanation for why we call it Shabbat Hagadol, if not necessarily the most executed, is it is tradition, I guess in some congregations, that on the Shabbat before Passover, the rabbi gives a very, very long Dvar Torah, going into the minutia of the laws of Passover and how to properly do everything. And yeah, I mean, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the laws of Passover. I don't think we will go on for extreme amounts of time. I was reading one commentary about an 18th century Hasidic rabbi who was said on Shabbat Hagadol to give 6-hour-long kind of expositions, or, I don't know if he was strictly just giving a sermon in that time, or if he was just kind of giving, the equivalent of like an extended adult ed class. But he kept everyone in their seats for 6 hours. And it was so engrossing that the children didn't even want to go home for lunch, that he totally had their attention. So certainly some great rabbinic heritage there that I'm not sure if I can even imagine. But I was also thinking about this idea of the extra long Dvar Torah on the Shabbos before Passover, and thinking again, it's hard to avoid the stress and the commotion of the week before Passover. And so what exactly would be the role of keeping people in shul extra long on a Saturday morning? And thinking about this both in the modern context and in kind of the more ancient context. And what would it mean, probably specifically for the men to be kept out of the house for an extra long time on a Saturday morning? And is that, possibly just a way to keep them out from being underfoot as you're getting ready for Pesach, and hopefully give, the hardworking, again, traditionally woman of the household, either an opportunity to do her own thing, or hopefully, God willing, to rest? Or is it the exact opposite? Or is it keeping the man out of the house really at the time when he could be most useful? And just another example of kind of, traditional Judaism perhaps being a little bit too patriarchal and a little bit perhaps out of touch with what might have actually been needed at the time. So just a little kind of different ways to think about it. And again, ways that are coming to me specifically this morning when Pesach starts tonight at the end of Shabbos. And today is really kind of our last chance to get ready. And getting ready this year, when Pesach starts immediately after Shabbat, does feel a little bit different in a number of ways. I know there was some controversy last time. I forget if Passover, I think it was when the second night fell on Saturday evening, and what that would do to our communal Seder, because technically you're not supposed to be cooking on Shabbat. So, it's something that maybe we don't have to deal with in a communal context this year, since we're all doing our own things or meeting over Zoom. And there's also the idea that even kind of the entire past week has been, the rhythms have been thrown off a little bit. It's traditional for firstborns to fast on the day before Passover in commemoration of being saved from the plague of the firstborns. No one is fasting today, because fasting is prohibited on Shabbat, with the rare exception of when Yom Kippur falls on Shabbat. And so we actually, for anyone who was either observing the fast or wanted to commemorate finishing a chunk of Jewish learning in order to avoid having a fast, we actually did that on Thursday morning. So 3 days before Passover this year, because you can't fast on Saturday, and you can't even hold this fast on a Friday, because that will mess up the beginning of Shabbat when Shabbat starts at sundown. So little changes like that. And of course, there's also been a ton of stuff written over what exactly do you do on Friday night to begin your celebration of Shabbat? Because if you've done things, again, to the letter of the classic law, you have already sold your chametz or gotten rid of your chametz by the end of by kind of Friday morning, because you can't do it on Shabbat. And so what do you do at a time when you need to eat challah? And you're not supposed to eat matzah yet because you're too close to the Seder, but you're also technically not supposed to have challah or bread in your house anymore. And the two solutions, the two classic solutions to that are either you get egg matzah, which I think we're all familiar with, which is matzah with some added ingredients, which as far as classic Jewish law is concerned, is not technically matzah. So you can eat that the day before the Seder. Or the rabbis also suggest the equivalent, explicitly the equivalent of kind of eating over the sink, right? You keep your challah on hand and you take it to a corner that is kind of separate from where your main Pesach prep and food is going on, and you kind of eat it furtively without making any crumbs, and then you go to your table and have your rest of your Friday evening meal and possibly your Shabbat morning meal. And it's funny to think about these habits, which, you know, maybe some of us come to on our own. I think I've been eating my most crumbly foods over the sink all week, but to see them reflected in actual kind of Jewish practice and halachic literature is a little bit unusual. And Barry put a question in the chat: what do we do about burning of the chametz? You were definitely supposed to do that yesterday. Fire, again, explicitly forbidden on Shabbat. And so again, needing to kind of push all of those rituals that normally feel like last minute rituals, needing to push them back at least 24 hours and establishing a different rules for things. There's 2 or 3 passages I just want to bring in from the conservative movement's Passover guidance, specifically because we are not a conservative shul, although many of our members, including myself, have roots in the conservative movement. And the conservative movement exists in an interesting place where they want Jewish tradition and Jewish law and halacha to be a real and present thing in people's lives. But I think they also recognize that for a lot of their members, of their wide and varied congregations certainly across the country and throughout the world, they need to be making some accommodations and some modernizations to allow people to actually want to kind of live with these things. And so I was going through, and both this year and last year, with the coronavirus adding untold amounts of unprecedented stress into our lives, the idea of kind of putting all of the stress of a traditional Pesach prep, especially when things like shopping feel really difficult and daunting in ways they never have before. I think there was recognition among the traditional Jewish world that maybe now was a time to kind of explore whatever leniencies there might be out there. And so I wanted to highlight just 2 or 3 short passages from the conservative movement's Pesach guidance, both as a way of kind of framing what it means to get ready for Passover, and as a way of thinking about, again, similar to what we discussed with the sacrifices, how do we build value into these processes that we are committing ourselves to? And so the first short passage I want to bring up is about cleaning the house, something that we can all get a little bit crazy with before Passover. And this is what the kind of Committee on Jewish Law for the Conservative Movement puts out to the world, and specifically to their member organizations. The general rule is places must be well searched and specifically cleaned for chametz, only if it's a place for which and in which chametz is normally consumed and cooked. So to clarify that, you need to search your kitchen. You don't necessarily need to search the darkest corner of your basement, unless you your dog or your kid is stealing a piece of bread and going to eat it in secret in the corner of the basement. We need to kind of focus in on the practical, not the absolute farthest flung spots of our house. Furthermore, the prohibition of owning and seeing chametz applies specifically to amounts of pure chametz, meaning like pure leavened water and flour product, that is at least the size of an olive. And this line is the kicker. This line is really the reason that I wanted to bring the entire passage. This is your yearly reminder that dirt is not chametz. And so an important thing to remember as we are, we only have 6 or 7 hours left until the holiday begins. The dust that is sitting under your cabinet in the corner of your kitchen is not by definition the chametz. Or if you see a crumb that you missed at some point over the next week, that is not an opportunity to beat your head against the wall and think that you haven't done good enough. We're all trying to do the best we can and make the practice meaningful for ourselves. And I just really love that this is your yearly reminder that dirt is not chametz. I want to bring up one other passage, and this is in relation to the burning that Barry was referencing. Traditionally, the day before, the morning before Passover begins, we take our last little bits of bread or whatever else it might be, and we take them outside and we burn them as an act of kind of destruction and making them ownerless. It is a mitzvah to search for and destroy chametz. If this is unusually difficult for you, it is well to remember that at the end of the process, we renounce all chametz, whether we are aware of it or not. If cleaning is sufficient to protect against obvious contact with chametz, we can rely on the formula of renunciation. And so just remembering that for all the emphasis that we have in traditional practice of really going above and beyond in preparation for Passover, we also build ourselves in quite a few loopholes. And that has to do both with the tradition of selling our chametz before Passover, right? And that was initially a way for Jewish grocers and business owners to not need to essentially completely go out of business because of the 8 days of Passover. And something that many of us kind of take advantage of as a way to, hold on to that cherished bottle of scotch or maybe even a sourdough starter that might be, hiding in the corner of a fridge that we don't want to have to get rid of. But also this idea that we can kind of make a declaration to make things ownerless, that the whole process of getting ready for Pesach is not one which is supposed to drive us exhausted into the ground, but one in which, I think it's really beautiful to look at Pesach through the lens of a fresh start. I think the idea of kind of spring cleaning, and going back to the poem with which I started this morning, spring cleaning and really celebrating spring for this idea of a fresh beginning. Certainly as we see more and more plants popping up, as we see more and more blooms starting to form, as we're able to open our windows and get some fresh air into our houses, as the light lingers longer into the evening. I think for many of us, both kind of metaphorically and literally, it's a time to kind of open our doors and go back into the world. And so the idea that we have this opportunity and this little bit of a push to do some sort of cleaning and cleansing, right? Even if it's not necessarily getting every crumb out of every crack in your countertop, but maybe it's, throwing away the 3-year-old mustard that's sitting at the back of your fridge, or finding, kind of some excuse to bring in some decluttering and to bring in some fresh light and some fresh air. I think Passover is a really powerful call to that. And I think it's also worth keeping in mind that, as we'll read tomorrow morning, Pesach was the original Jewish New Year. The Torah dedicates Passover or Rosh Chodesh Nisan as this is the new beginning to you. This is the head of all the months. And so looking to that as a reminder that this is an opportunity for newness, an opportunity for a reset, and also thinking thinking a little bit into the future. As tomorrow night at the end of our Seder, we'll begin counting the Omer. We'll begin counting night by night the 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. And thinking about the fact that this year, maybe more than any others, I think we'll be able to see definite changes around us in the next 7 weeks, at least God willing, with the increasing rollout of the vaccines, with more nicer weather and opportunity to hopefully safely gather outside in ways and see some people and connect with people in ways that we really haven't been able to in a long time. I hope that the beginning of Pesach and the beginning of the Omer really is an opportunity to kind of take stock. And as we count those 7 weeks, think about how you feel on day 1 and think about how you feel on day 49. And use that as a little bit of a tracker to see if there have been, hopefully, positive changes around you and increased opportunities for connection and really, a celebration of change that starts with this spring holiday and will, God willing, move us forward into a full and beautiful spring and summer. So those are my hopefully not too long words on Shabbat Hagadol, the great Shabbat. I don't know if anyone else has any reflections or thoughts they want to share on starting Passover and any Passover prep they may or may not have done or done differently in these Passovers of the coronavirus. So we can take a minute, see if anyone has anything they want to share. Otherwise, we'll move towards the end of services. Great, quiet bunch today, but that's okay. I am going to turn around and close the ark. And we will continue. I won't put it up on the screen, but we'll continue with the full Kaddish. And I invite anyone who wants to unmute to participate in the Kaddish to do so.
Amen.
בעמוד ובחרתי והמליך מלכותי וחייכון וימכון וחיי לכל בית ישראל בעגלה בזמן קריב ימרו
Amen. Yishmi Rabba Mevara, Le'olam Maya,
יתברך וישבח יתברך וישמע וינשא יתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי וקודשה
B'chichu.
כילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תשוקתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה וימרו
Amen.
גדול תורדון לכל בית ישראל קדם והון דבשמיא וימרו
Amen.
שם רב מן שמיא וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל וימרו
Oseh shalom b'mrama, v'yaseh shalom aleinu Amen.
Amen. And I will put us back on mute, and we will conclude our services today with the Aleinu, which I will put up on the screen. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, latei gedula leotzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei haratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot hadama, shelo sam chelkeinu kahem, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ, ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגבי מרומים, הוא אלוהינו אין עוד, אמת מלכנו אפס ולתו, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעת יום להשיבותה אל לבביך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים, בשמיים ממעל ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו echad. And in just a moment, we'll continue with the Mourner's Kaddish. This week, Congregation Avas Achim marks the Yortzeiten of Esther Rubin, Sarah Shorman, Natalie Stone, and Alex Scott Friedman. May their memories be a blessing. Anyone who wants to join me in the Mourner's Kaddish, please unmute and do so now. V'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'alma yivrach ve'amlich malchutei v'chayechon v'chayechon v'chayei l'chol beit Yisrael v'agala u'bizman kariv imru amen.
Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach Leolam Olam.
Yitbarach v'yishbach v'yitar v'yishomam v'yinasei v'yitadar v'yitalech v'yithalal v'yishemish v'yishach b'richu.
Amen.
Everyone who is standing may be seated. Once again, so nice to see you all. Shabbat Shalom. And Yasher Koach to my mom for the Haftorah and everyone else who helped out this morning. And of course, welcome back both to Jerry and to Rachel. Really good to have both of you back with us after a long hiatus. Whole bunch of things going on certainly over the next 24 hours and really over the next couple weeks. So tonight you are all on your own for the Seder. And then tomorrow morning we will be back here at 9:30. Hopefully some of you will be willing to roll out of bed and log on to Zoom. It's the same link as this morning. And of course, Alex Eidman is going to be joining us tomorrow morning to lead us in the prayer for dew towards the end of services. So if you miss hearing Alex's voice, great chance to tune in and hear him and see him. And then tomorrow night at 6 p.m., we will be having our second ever Zoom Seder at CAA. It should be really wonderful. Of course, if you are coming or interested in coming, and if you want to invite any friends and family, the more the merrier. I think it will not be too long, and it will be a lot of fun. And so that's tomorrow morning and tomorrow night. And then, of course, we're back. We're not going to have Adult Ed this week. We will have a Thursday morning minyan with Hallel. And then next Saturday, we'll be back for the end of Passover and Shabbat morning combined into one. And we will be doing Yizkor next Saturday morning in honor of the end of Passover. So anyone who's interested in joining for Yizkor. A couple other things just to put on our longer term events coming up. This one is already in the e-blast, but in honor of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, on April 8th, Karina Pupko, who has done a lot of work as a Holocaust educator at Yad Vashem in Israel, and of course, who we all know as our beloved former Rebbitzin. She will be leading us in a session in honor of Holocaust Memorial Day. We are asking that people pre-register, not that you can't come if you don't, but just having an idea of the size of the group will help her kind of tailor the activity. So that's April 8th. And actually, I just found out on April 7th, the day before, Wednesday, this isn't specifically in honor of Yom HaShoah, but Temple Shirat Hayam in Swampscott, who we've done some work with before, they are starting a 3-speaker social justice speaker series. And Governor Deval Patrick will be speaking on Wednesday night, the 7th. So the link for that the information for that will be going out in this week's e-blast, but just to put that on your calendar. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of other good stuff in there that I won't go into right now. Any other announcements or things you want the community to know before we wrap up with services and go get ready for our Seders? Yeah, Jerry.
You know, just on a final note, this morning for me, I want to thank everyone for their cards and letters and telephone calls. It helped me quite a bit to encourage me to keep going, and I'll be forever grateful.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for the reminder. You know, as we'll be reading at the beginning of our Seders, in the spirit of kind of let all who are hungry come and eat. Passover is certainly a time for outreach and for opening our doors. And even if that's something we can't be doing on a literal level right this second or this year, remembering, you know, the next week, 8 days, whatever it is, it's a great time to check in on anyone who or reconnect with anyone who you haven't spoken to in a while. You're not sure how they're doing. Certainly, you know, use that as a thank you, Jerry, for kind of reminding us the value of our own support system. And certainly, you know, I would encourage everyone to think of a couple friends who they might not have reached out to in a while, and use Pesach as an excuse to kind of pick up the phone or even, you know, pen and paper if you're feeling old school, and reach out and see how people are doing. It's been a long year of increased isolation and disconnection, and whatever we can do as individuals in a community to kind of battle back against that, I think is really important. So thank you, Jerry. And it is good to see you. And on that note, we will turn to Hatikva and follow that up with Kiddush. If you'd like to join me, please do so. Kol v'alevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiya u'fatei mizrach kadima ayin letzion sofia. Allah avda tikvatenu, ha'tikva bat shnot albayim, liyotam chofshi ve'artzenu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim, liyotam chofshi ve'artzenu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim. And Kiddush. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. B'nei uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam, oti le'olam. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. Ki shesh yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, v'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot Uve'yom hashvi Shabbat vayinafa, Shabbat vayinafa, Shabbat vayinafa, v'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. Alkein berach Adonai et yom hashva v'yikadsheu savri
L'chaim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol yeh bidvaro.
Amen. Shabbat shalom, everyone. Shabbat
Shabbat
sameach.
Shabbat shalom.
Everybody. Chag
Yeah.
Sameach.
Good to
Good to see you.
Good to see you
Hag
too.
Sameach
Good
to
to
all.
see you, to all.
Hag Sameach to everyone.
Sameach.
Hazissen.
This in Paso. This in
Gene, how
Pesach.
are you doing?
This in Pesach.
How are you doing, Gene?
Alex?
Are you,
Thank
you recuperating or what?
Beautiful
Yeah, asking
Oh,
you.
yeah, sorry. I
He's
didn't hear you.
recuperated.
Yes, much better, much better. Thank you.
Oh, good, good.
Nice Pesach to you.
Oh,
Nice
and
Pesach
you too, and Bob.
Thank you.
And
to you and
Eugene
your
and
family.
Sharon.
Bob, are you cooking up a storm today?
Not on Shabbos.
Johnny, a good Shabbos,
Not me.
good Yontif.
Good
Good
yontif,
Shabbos,
good
and
yontif, good
everyone have a good
yontif.
Pesach.
To Yaakov.
The gentif to everybody.
Good to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody tomorrow.